Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
ගෑස් ඕනේ නෑ. පියුරිට් එකට අදම මාරු වෙන්න.
On 1st and 9 this Thursday, the 17th of November 2022. New approach. Sri Lanka to supply food to islands and Middle Eastern countries where food resources are scarce. Calls for assurances. Opposition calls on government to not meddle with elections, urges to reassure that provincial elections will be held in due time. Clarifications. State Minister of Finance Shehan Singh says that the government has not made a decision to restructure domestic debt.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Andrew Bernard. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
A very good evening and welcome to AdaDerana 24's English News. I'm Andrew Bernard. Now, President Ranil Wickremesinghe says that the Sri Lankan government held discussions with Singaporean officials pertaining to exploring opportunities available in supplying food to island nations and Middle East countries that lack food resources. Speaking at an event in Colombo, the head of state said Sri Lankan government is looking at establishing an agro-university in the country with the intention of modernizing agriculture, and it is also focusing on developing English literacy in the country over the next few years.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe, along with US Ambassador Julie Chang, took part in the 70th anniversary of the United States Sri Lanka Fulbright Commission program held in Colombo yesterday.
Sri Lanka and US had strong links during World War II and became an independent nation. It's on this that we have built our relations. Our relations are not only based on education and culture. There's economic assistance, there are political issues on which we stood on the same side, science, technology, many areas. But I would say the foundation is the educational exchange that has taken place, especially with coming into effect of the Fulbright Commission. To talk to Dr. Bandaranaike. Now, she's going to be needed because we are going to modernize agriculture. And as I said on the Monday, this is the start. Find the land, modernize agriculture. Today we had a discussion with some of the Singaporeans of growing food for those island nations and the Middle East, which hasn't got really the food resources or the backup that we require. And when you say Davis, I was anyway going to talk to you about Davis University, the best in California for agriculture. So that's one of the universities which we will hope to collaborate with. As you know, we are working with some of the other universities trying to collaborate in the Californian university system. So these are some of the links that we've had going into these areas, and a new agro-technology university which will come up, which will combine the TRI amongst others to work with some of the American institutions on how we upgrade our research. Far as English language is concerned, as the minister knows, our next 10 years are going to focus a lot on English and how we train the teachers, how we train the trainers. That's a big project. And certainly we will be starting on it, and we'll have to depend on the Fulbright scholarships at assistance at that time of getting counterparts from America down here.
Our partnership and commitment to promoting mutual understanding between the United States and Sri Lanka remains strong. Through the Fulbright program, thousands have had the precious opportunity to study and live in our two countries, to share knowledge, to develop professional relationships, and to develop lifelong friendships.
Now the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa arrived in Sri Lanka for a short visit last evening after attending the G20 summit in Bali. The South African President met with President Ranil Wickremesinghe at the Katunaike Air Force Base for discussions on bilateral issues. The discussions were focused on further strengthening the bilateral relationship between the two countries, aiming at economic cooperation and investment. During the meeting, it was also discussed to expand tourism in Sri Lanka and receiving South African assistance, guidance and counseling in setting up a credible truth-seeking mechanism to achieve a lasting reconciliation amongst communities. Minister of Foreign Affairs Ali Sabri, President's Secretary Saman Ekanayaka and several other senior officials from both countries were present at the meeting. The State Minister of Finance Shayan Simsingh said today that the government has not made any decision to restructure domestic debt, as negotiations of treatments on external debt are still being discussed with external, bilateral and commercial creditors. Taking to Twitter, the minister said that this was because it would have an adverse impact on domestic banking sector, the insurance sector and superannunciation funds. As such, he added that the government has no intention to impose any treatment on domestic debt. The CBSL governor said that the average inflation, which was at a value of 70% 2 months ago, has now decreased to 66% and is expected to fall by 4 to 6% by the end of this year. The CBSL governor stated that the customers who have been inconvenienced due to the increase in the interest rates charged for loans obtained under variable interest rates in the past are able to get relief by negotiating with the bank. The governor made these remarks when parliamentarians inquired regarding the aforementioned at the Ministerial Consultative Committee on Finance, Economic Stabilization and National Policies held yesterday in Parliament. Now, the members of Parliament also pointed out that due to the increase in interest rates, the entire income of some creditors has been to be paid for loan installments. The CBSL governor said that customers can pay only the relevant interest for a grace period in consultation with the bank, and added that instructions have been given to the banks in this regard. Furthermore, adding to the conditions of the International Monetary Fund, a new act has been drafted to make the central bank an independent institution, and the necessary work is being done, said the central bank governor. Now, opposition leader Sajith Premadasa urged the government to reassure Parliament that it will not allow the Election Commission to postpone the elections and will allow it to act independently in the coming times to hold the provincial elections. In response, Prime Minister Dinesh Gunawardena said that the Election Commission has always acted independently, and despite the government or the opposition's approaches, the Commission will hold the elections when it sees fit.
මං ඔබතුමාගෙන් කරන ඉල්ලීම තමයි මේ සභාවට දෙනවද ප්‍රතිඥාවක් විශේෂයෙන්ම පළාත් පාලන මැතිවරණය කල් දමන්න නැතුව මාර්තු 20 වෙනිදා වෙන විට අලුතෙන් සභා ස්ථාපනය කරන ආකාරයට මැතිවරණ කොමිසමට නිදහස ලබා දෙනවද ඇඟිලි ගැසීමකින් තොරව මේ මැතිවරණය තබන්න උත්තර දෙන්නකෝ තමුන්නාන්සේ
මැතිවරණ කොමිෂන් සභාවට එය ස්වාධීන කොමිෂන් සභාවක් ඒ නිසා ඔබතුමාලා ගිහිල්ලා හමුණත් වෙන අය ගිහිල්ලා හමුණත් ඒ කියන කාරණා මත තමයි මැතිවරණ කොමිසම වැඩ කරන්නේ.
ලෝක ඉතිහාසයේ ප්‍රථම වතාවට රට බංකොලොත් කරපු ආණ්ඩුවක් ආයෙත් ඉදිරිපත් කරනවා. ආණ්ඩුවක් රට බංකොලොත් කරුවා නම් කරන්න තියෙන්නේ දාලා යන්න. මේ අවුරුද්දට මේ කෑමටයි ණය ගෙවන්න නැත්තු ඇමරිකාට ඩලර් බිලියන 12ක් කොහොමද හොයාගන්නේ කියලා මේක නන්නේ. බුදල්ල මෙතුමා දැන් කොහොමද මේ 12 බිලියන් ඩොලර්ස් හොයාගන්නේ ලබන අවුරුද්දට පාසල් උපකට 100-300කින් වැඩි වෙලා. මට අදු දෙයක් කෙනෙක්ව CR පොත රුපියල් 800යි කියලා.
කරුණාකරලා කියන්න ඔබතුමාලගේ ඔය ආණ්ඩුව ආපුවාම මේ ආදායම සකස් කරගන්න විදිය කොහොමද?
ඩොක්ටර් ජෝන්නේ මම කියන්නම්කෝ. අපේ රටේ ඉන්න ශ්‍රමිකයෝ අපිට සල්ලි යවන්නේ නැහනේ. අපි කරන්නේ ඉස්සෙල්ලා මොකද්ද? සෙන්ට්‍රල් බැංකුවේ ස්වාධීන කරලා නිදහසේ වැඩ කරන්න වාතාවරණයක් අපි හදනවා. ඒතර ඒගොල්ලෝ සල්ලි යවනවා.
දැන් ඔබතුමා උපකල්පනය කරනවා ඔබතුමාලා આવොත් ශ්‍රමිකයෝ සල්ලි එවයි කියලා. ඇයි මෙහෙම සිල්ලර සරල පිළිතුරු මේ ගරු සභාවට දෙන්නේ ගරු කතානායකතුමනි.
රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ අයවැය කතාවේදී රුපියල ශක්තිමත් වෙමින් පවතිනවායි කියලා එතුමා කියනවා. ඒක ඊටාම අසත්‍ය ප්‍රකාශයක්. වෙලා තියෙන එකම දේ තමයි රුපියල බලහත්කාරයෙන් මහ බැංකුව එදා අජිත් නිවාඩ් කබ්‍රාල්ලා රඳවගෙන හිටියා වගේ රුපියල තාම රඳවගෙන තියාගෙන ඉන්නවා. ඒ තියාගෙන ඉඳ තමයි රුපියල 371 ඔය තියෙන්නේ. රුපියල පාවෙන්න ඇරියා නම් ඕක යනවා 450ට.
Now, Treasury Secretary Mahinda Sirivardhana defends the lack of concessions through Budget 2023, emphasizing that the government's weak financial situation has not allowed room for such relief. But budgetary concessions rather will be provided once the country's financial situation improves. Now, the governor of the central bank, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, meanwhile, said that the austerity measures taken by the government, if not taken now, would only leave the country to deal with similar shocks next year.
We know that the IMF austerity measures are expected. If you can give us a timeline and the progress made, what these austerity measures are going to mean for the people.
In terms of austerity measures, we should not get confused by the statements, this is government, private sector, and government is the top, private sector is on the below. I think that's a misconception to me. What is important is, at this point, is to protect the people of this country. So when you protect the people of this country, what is the priority? Who should be protected first in this kind of situation? Who has been affected most? If you look at when inflation is running at 70%, the people who have been affected most are the people who have low income people, who are vulnerable. Who are affected most are people who have saved money, pensioners, fixed income earners, because their income was 100 last year, 70% inflation is now 30. So they have to live out of 30 rupees compared to 100 rupees last year. So what is the priority for the government and the central bank? Who should be protected? Whether we should let what they so-called private sector industries, let them perform as they go, and let the poor and vulnerable and savers and pensioners, fixed income people to suffer more. So this is the policy choice. If we had to make this choice before the economy was going to crash, obviously we had space. But unfortunately, we had to deal with this situation when economy was crashing. So then priority for any responsible central bank or responsible government is the priority is to protect the most vulnerable and poor people and pensioners. This is why I think savers should be protected, because their incomes are, real incomes are down. And poor and vulnerable find it difficult to live out of their incomes. They should be supported through social safety nets, the cash transfers. Why these taxes are important? People who earn more should be contribute more. People who don't earn don't have to pay. Then there's an indirect tax. Indirect tax is affecting more to the poor. The world economy is going through a even worse year next year. So we have to prepare for that. This year, luckily, world economy has been doing better even than last year because of the recovery after COVID. And that is why we are seeing our exports have been performing much better than last year. But next year, we can't expect the same thing. If we don't do things now and prepare for the next year, if our foreign exchange earnings are going to be much lower, then we should be preparing to face that shock also next year. This is why it's important for us to understand why we need to do these things now. Everyone will have to share the burden. Poor, less. High income people, high. That's basic principle.
While also addressing whether segments of the economy, the SMEs to corporates to other industries, whether they're protected, what more can be done in terms of reforming policy to ensure these entities are protected?
The limited ability of the government to provide some concessions due to its already large expenditure, the budget. If the government is not going to raise taxes and not going to collect the revenues, and then how we basically this situation, whether we are only collecting taxes from the private sector. No, it's not the case, because whether you like it or not, we have these expenses in the government budget which have been accumulated over the years. So that's why we basically in our day-to-day language say that there's a lead time that you can get the revenues, and at the same time the way that you can address some of these issues. If we are not going to get these taxes, how we are going to finance other operations of the government? The most important and example that I can cite is the central bank financing. In fact, sometimes we hear there are articles and people are blaming the central bank is printing money. In fact, it is not the central bank, it is the Ministry of Finance or the government asking from the central bank to print money. Why? Because government is not getting enough money or enough resources to meet it. How you basically break this? On one hand, if you continue with this money printing, obviously there will be inflation going forward. But at the same time, if you are going to taxes the people, there will be some implications. And I understand the situation. It's not an easy task for the people to pay taxes as well, particularly the private sector and SMEs and various other entities. But remember, we are in a crisis. So if we are not introducing this sort of policies to at least to get some amount of revenue and to try the financing that we are going to get from the central bank, the situation is going to be much, much dire. volatile. And on the other hand, when you are trying to, reduce the government expenditures, you can't do it overnight. You have to implement policies gradually. For example, reduction of the 1.4 million employees in the government. It's not an easy task, and you can't send them home overnight. That's why in this particular budget, there's a commission going to be appointed to look into this matter, how you basically streamline this system and you have kind of an optimal system in the country. And that's why President indicated in his budget that this time, this particular budget, there won't be salary increase, but when the things are going to be improved and with this commission and its recommendations going to be implemented, that request or that situation would be considered going forward.
And we'll be back with more news on what decision was handed over by the Supreme Court over the Inland Revenue Amendment Bill. Stay with us to find out.
Big 3.
Welcome back. Now, an extraordinary gazette notification was issued by the Minister of Transport and Highways, Bandula Gunawardena, increasing fees levied on the registration of vehicles and annual revenue licenses. The regulation made by the Minister cited that as the motor traffic regulations of number 4 of 2022 will come into force from tomorrow onwards. Accordingly, the annual revenue license fees and the fees for first registration and delayed first registration of vehicles has been increased. Further, the fee for regulation and registration and delayed registration of new owners, fee for issuing a duplicate of a certificate of registration fee for the registration of garages and other miscellaneous fees have also been increased. The Speaker Mahinda Abeyewardena says that the amendments proposed by the Attorney General for the Inland Revenue Amendment Bill should be included at the committee stage before the bill is passed. The Speaker made these comments in Parliament today while conveying the determination of the Supreme Court on the petition that was challenged in the Supreme Court.
The Inland Revenue Amendment Draft Bill was published in the Government Gazette on the 12th of October. The special gazette was issued by the Minister of Finance, Economic Stabilisation and National Policies to amend the Inland Revenue Act. According to the draft proposal, it was decided to impose taxes on people based on different income earning criteria. If passed in Parliament, the proposed bill will revise a number of levies and will further empower the Inland Revenue Department as the primary agent for collecting taxes and dealing with issues arising with taxes on behalf of the government. However, an application challenging the draft bill was filed before the Supreme Court on the 27th of October by a general manager of an apparel factory. The petitioner alleged that the government has reduced the minimum taxable income of a person from 250,000 rupees to 100,000 rupees, placing a heavy tax burden on the general public already hit hard by the ongoing economic crisis. It was pointed out that the new income tax proposals discourage many sectors in the country, including exports, local industries, and developmental activities. The petitioner also alleged that the proposed income tax changes in the amendment draft bill are a serious violation of the government's obligations to guarantee social security and ensure public welfare pursuant to the Constitution. The petitioner, noting that Articles 14, 16, 22, 29, 36 and 39 are unconstitutional, requested the Supreme Court to determine that the draft bill should be passed by a two-thirds majority in the Parliament and a public referendum. In this backdrop, speaking at the Parliament today, Speaker Mahinda Abeyewardena stated that the amendments proposed by the Attorney General for the Inland Revenue Amendment Bill should be included at the committee stage before the bill is passed.
Now, the all-share price index closed in red as a result of price losses in counters such as Selenco Insurance, LOLC Holdings and John Keel's Holdings, with turnover crossing 76 million rupees. A similar behavior was witnessed in the S&P SL 20 as the index ended 2,460.17, losing 4.3 points. High net worth and institutional investor participation was noted in John Keel's Holdings and Hunas Hotels Falls. Mixed interest was observed in Sri Lanka Telecom, Lanka IOC and Expo Lanka Holdings, while the retail interest was noted in Brown's Investment, Serendip Hotels and Prime Land Residencies. Foreign participation in market activity remained at subdued levels, with foreigners closing as net buyers. Now let's take a look at how the rupee traded against other major currencies in the world. Now, oil extended declines as concerns over geopolitical tensions eased and as rising numbers of COVID-19 cases in China added to demand worries in the world's largest crude importer.
Brent crude was down by $1.30 to $91.56 a barrel. Meanwhile, US West Texas Intermediate crude slid 1.7% or $1.42 to $84.17. Oil prices declined yesterday and were still lower early morning today as NATO made clear that the missile that fell in a Polish village did not come from Russia. Oil prices jumped on the initial reports of the incident, in which 2 people lost their lives, as initial reactions from politicians suggested a further escalation between the West and Russia. Later, as facts began to emerge, the comments changed the tension and was effectively diffused, pushing prices lower. Concern about weak demand in China also weighed on the market. Today, China reported daily rise in COVID-19 infections, and Chinese refiners have asked to reduce Saudi crude volume in December and are also slowing Russian crude purchases. While China's COVID caseload is small compared with the rest of the world, it maintains strict policies to quash out cases before they further spread, dampening fuel demand. Meanwhile, supply is also tightening in the month of November as OPEC Plus implement their latest output cut aimed at supporting the market. Further, the European Union ban on Russian oil is set to take effect in the month of December.
Now, nagging recession and interest rate worries had Europe's markets fluttering today as Britain looked to put last month's disastrous fiscal experiment behind it with an austere-looking budget. Overnight, in Asia, grim signals from Macron Technology about excess inventories and sluggish demand sent chipmaker stocks sprawling. European markets were lower today as investors focused on geopolitics and a big budget announcement in the UK. The Stoxx 600 index fluctuated between marginal gains and losses in early trade, but fell more firmly into red later in the day. All sectors and major bourses made losses by early afternoon, led by mining stocks, which were down 2.3%. Meanwhile, global markets were watching developments in Ukraine as the fallout from a missile hitting Polish territory continued. Overnight, shares in the Asia-Pacific traded mostly lower, with the Hang Seng index falling 2.5% as Chinese technology stocks saw sharp losses. In mainland China, the Shanghai Composite fell 0.52% and the Shang-Sen component also fell 0.69%. Meanwhile, Australia's S&P 200 gained 0.19% as the nation's unemployment numbers came in better than expected. In Japan, the Nikkei 225 shed 0.35% to end the session at 27,930 points, while the Topix gained 0.15% to close at 1,966 points. Further, South Korea's Kospi fell 1.14% after delayed open and closed its session at 2,448 points. Overnight on Wall Street, US stocks fell as investors weighed a gloomy fourth quarter outlook cut from Target, triggering sharp losses in its stock price as well as other industry peers. Welcome back. The UK Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt delivered his autumn statement today, announcing a slew of tax rises and spending cuts as he attempts to plan a substantial hole in the country's public finances. He unveiled a sweeping £55 billion fiscal plan, which is about $66 billion as he sought to restore the country's credibility under new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's government. He also confirmed a substantial increase to windfall taxes on the profits of oil and gas companies and additional investment in schools and National Health Service. The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility now estimates that the UK economy is in recession and that GDP will contract by 1.4% to 2023, while inflation is predicted to hit 9.1% this year and 7.4% next year. The Sri Lankan cricketer Danushka Gunatilaka, who was arrested on charges of sexual assault in a woman in Australia, was granted bail by the Magistrates Court of Downing Centre Regional Court in Sydney. Accordingly, the cricketer was released on a cash bail of 150,000 Australian dollars while being imposed on other many strict bail conditions. According to the conditions, Danushka Gunatilaka has been ordered to report to the police every day and is also imposed from a curfew of 9 p.m. to 6 a.m.
Sri Lankan batsman Danushka Gunatilaka, who was in Australia for the ICC Men's T20 World Cup, was arrested in the early hours of the 6th of November from the Sydney hotel in which the team was accommodated, following an incident of an alleged sexual assault he committed. He was charged with 4 counts of sexual intercourse without consent after allegedly sexually assaulting a 29-year-old woman in Sydney on the 2nd of November, days after they matched on an online dating app. Gunatilaka spent 11 nights in custody after he was refused bail in Downing Centre Local Court on the 7th of November. His lawyers have made a bail application in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, which was listed to be heard next month. However, the matter reappeared in the local court list today when defence barrister Murugan Thangaraj applied for Gunatilaka's release. According to the police prosecutor, they had accepted the material before the court, including new proposed bail conditions, allowing Danushka Gunatilaka to make a secondary application. However, the police argued that there are 2 unacceptable risks: that the accused would fail to appear in court and that he would endanger the safety of the complainant if granted bail. In this backdrop, defence barrister Murugan Thangaraj submitted that his client was being supported by the Sri Lankan Cricket Association and the Sri Lankan government. He argued that if Gunatilaka breaches his bail, his career would be over. Thangaraj said Gunatilaka's supporters were friends of his agent and friends of people in important positions in Sri Lanka. He also argued that if his client was an Australian citizen, of course he would be on bail in these circumstances. The barrister also argued that any claimed risk of his client fleeing Australia was theoretical. The magistrate granted bail to Danushka Gunatilaka on conditions including a 150,000 Australian dollar surety from an acceptable person and the accused agreeing to forfeit of $50,000 if failed to comply. The conditions also include reporting to the Eastwood Police Station daily, a curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., not contacting the complainant, and a ban on accessing Tinder and other dating applications. The case is due to be taken up in court again on the 12th of January.
And that concludes tonight's edition of First at 9. Join us again tomorrow at the same time for the very latest news. Until then, visit our website www.AdaDerana.lk for more news. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.